All right. Tim in Tampa, thanks for waiting. Tim, you're on. I hope you were picking up your phone.
How are you? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Great. I want to say, first of all, I really appreciate the show. I first found this through YouTube links to some random clip of you, Matt, arguing with a theist, and I really appreciated the things you had to say.
Thank you.
And so my question is, I was raised Christian, but I left the church when I was 25, and I'm now a proud atheist. Now that I'm outside of the religious structure, I look back on the beliefs I had, and I'm very convinced that the religious beliefs I had before were quite irrational. Mm-hmm. So now that I feel like I'm taking a much more rational approach to life, I'm kind of torn on how hard I should try to convince theists that what they believe is wrong.
So it kind of depends on what you mean by how hard you should try. Like, I'm going to try as hard as I can, but you don't owe anybody an explanation, and you should not be forced to have a conversation that you're not comfortable with, and that's true for others as well. So one of the things, we've joked about, hey, we don't make outgoing calls from the show, and I don't go around knocking on doors. And if somebody's having a conversation about religion at dinner, I don't tend to go over to their table and interrupt them to, tell them just how wrong I think they are. So there are times when there's no doubt that I have been an arrogant, condescending ass and incredibly strident with some people.
No, not you.
Not me, but people have that perception of me. And there are other times when I'm probably overly patient and overly willing to make, concessions to try to further the conversation along, and that's because I care. I want to represent my views as best I can, and I want them to be convincing. Different people are going to be offended at different points in a conversation. There are people who are offended that we exist at all. There are people who are offended that we will not shut up. There are people who are taking offense on behalf of their God, and I think that it takes many different types. Somebody that I might not be able to reach could be reached by somebody being nicer, could be reached by somebody who was less nice. One of the most effective ways that people have found their way free of religion because of this show, based on the emails that I've received, is there are theists who would call in the past and have arguments and just get madder and madder and madder, and then they stopped calling, but they kept watching, and their goal was to prove me wrong. And that allowed them to convince themselves that they were in fact the ones that were mistaken.
Okay.
So there's no one perfect way. There's no one silver bullet argument. We need diplomats and firebrands, and perhaps some people who can do both in different situations.
Yeah. I actually recently started a podcast. Started recording one. We haven't aired any of it yet, but it started out being the purpose was it was me and a Christian, and we were, having debates about things, and the original purpose was to, kind of understand each other and get a better understanding of our mutual viewpoints on issues. But the further I go, and we've recorded 5 episodes so far, the further I go, the more I really kind of just want to prove him wrong. I feel like, go ahead.
That's a little bit of a problem because it's kind of a shifting of the burden of proof. In some cases, it may be possible to prove someone wrong. But if you adopt that stance of I'm going to prove you wrong and you fail to prove them wrong, they're going to stick with their beliefs. And it is the case that if they have a positive claim, they are the one with the burden of proof, and they need to be the one who actually demonstrates it. So it's kind of like saying, I can't prove, right now over the course of this call that your name is actually Tim. But my failure to prove that doesn't mean that your name is or isn't Tim. It's a completely separate issue. Yeah. And I am an anti-theist. I am a strong atheist. I don't believe that a God exists. And under most normative uses, I actually believe that gods don't exist. But I don't adopt that burden of proof because it's unnecessary. Because even if I'm wrong or unable to make that case, it's still the case that the theists have not made their case.
Yeah, I agree. So you think in some cases it's better to not try to force the issue of proving the positive case?
Well, if you think you can, if they've made some claim that you can demonstrate reasonably is incorrect, or then by all means, that's probably the best thing you could do is to demonstrate that it's incorrect.
Yeah.
But if you can't, and in general in conversations from my history here and in debates and other things, people tend to change their mind a little more, or a little more readily to change their mind when they feel that they have led themselves to that point, which is why I'm a huge advocate of the Socratic method of asking questions.
Right. Well, that makes sense. I won't hold you any longer. Thanks for your response.
Thanks, Tim.
Sure.
Bye.
Yeah, one of the pitfalls of trying to prove a theist wrong is that as is the case of some of the people we get email from, they get some information from bad sources, and they get themselves backed into a corner. And so what they think is this, killer disproof of something the theist has said, they whip out, something, and the theist comes back and says, "Oh, but that's not true, and here's the real deal." Right. And then they call us asking us to bail them out of a bad argument.
It's kind of funny. So I'm working on a project through Patreon, but all the videos are available for free. This isn't an advertisement for that in any way. It's on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/sansdeity, SANSDEITY, or sans.deity. And I'm producing videos that talk about and teach the arguments so that you're not actually operating off a script, you have some understanding of it. Well, we recently went and saw this movie called Patterns of Evidence, Exodus, and it is kind of a respin of the age-old argument about trying to date the Exodus. And the fact of the matter is we cannot date the Exodus. We don't have enough information to confirm that it existed at any point in time. There are bits and pieces that would lead you to a late date of 1250. There are bits and pieces that would lead you to a date of around 1450. There are some who say it should be 1650. There are even some who say it should be 2450. And when you're in that situation, the only reasonable position that I think everybody should take, including the experts, is we do not have any way to confirm that the Exodus actually happened at all, let alone date it. But instead, what some people have done is, because we don't have the evidence we would expect in this particular time frame, instead of saying, Israel Finkelstein during the movie pointed out the Exodus didn't happen at that time in that way. But others will take that and say, oh, the Exodus didn't happen. It's fiction. Now you have made a positive thing that you may not be able to prove. How do you prove that this is fiction? It's far better to just simply acknowledge that they haven't made their case yet. And so I just released a video today, actually covers that movie. There are other videos coming up soon, including pitfalls to avoid when you're engaged in those conversations and debates, things to look out for, like, are you doing it for the right reasons? Are you actually listening, to what they say and formulating a response, or waiting for your turn to speak? And a bunch of stuff like that. There are mistakes that I think are common among atheists, secularists of all stripes, where they see the religious claims as absurd, and I agree. They see them as unsupported, and I agree. And then they want to go the extra step of, oh, this is a fiction, or this is clearly just a copy of this. Moses stole the 10 Commandments from, the Hammurabic Code. Adopting position, Jesus never existed, it was a fiction. Instead of saying, we don't have enough evidence to conclude that he did, which is a big problem on its own. They've made a claim that they have not supported in thousands of years, and we've had these arguments over and over again. There are occasions where I think there are people on my side of a particular issue who overstate the case, and I think it's a mistake, and I'll speak out about it. I've made the same mistake. I've overstated things a number of times. Well, once or twice.
Well, I think what's important too is when you're evaluating a claim, you have to consider what would have to be, what kind of evidence would we have to find in order to say that this claim is likely true or definitely true. And if you go through an examination of the evidence and you don't find that evidence, doesn't necessarily mean the claim is false, but it's a pretty good clue that, you know, that the person that's asserting that this thing is true is not on firm footing.
Right.
And so, I mean, I think I was with you. I did a show. It was talking about some descriptions of what happened in the Babylonian captivity in the Old Testament, and certain events that if we look at the way it's written in the Bible, and then you go back and you examine historical records, you ask yourself, what would we expect to find? Mm-hmm. And so one of the things we would expect to find is if there were Jews taken into captivity, we would expect to find some record of that in the Babylonian records. And in fact, we do. We find records that document that this happened, and so if two armies are on the battlefield and they're fighting a war, usually the victor writes the history, but frequently the loser has something to say about it as well.
Yeah.
And if you go and you find the records of the side that is supposedly lost, and they document the same events, well then that's a pretty good piece of evidence that this battle took place probably mostly as written. And so these are some of the things that we have to take a look at.
But if you have competing records,
right,
then you don't know what happened.
Yeah, then you have to look at other sources of evidence to find out what probably happened, and you may never know.
Yeah, one of the examples that I used in the video, which got released today, is I could put my phone number on the screen and X out some of the numbers, mm-hmm. and then tell you to call me because I've given you a pattern that coincides with my number.
Yeah.
Certainly, I've posted my number and not somebody else's. If we removed the X's, we would find this. And what I think has happened, and this is speculative, when it comes to the Exodus, is that you have a number of events that are occurring at unknown points in the timeline, mm-hmm. that many years after the fact have been conflated into one narrative and embellished, because let's say your family was captive here, and famine struck the land, and so you ended up free. Well, what kind of story are you likely to tell about that? Mm-hmm. I mean, are you likely to say, we don't know what happened, but a famine happened and now we're free? Or if you had been praying to your deity to free you, would you say, yep, our God came in and smote them with a famine, and that's what freed us? I mean, this is all so straightforward, and the evidence that we find is pretty mundane. Hey, we found some evidence that there were shepherds in Goshen around this time, and we found evidence that there was, an economic collapse in Egypt around this time, and well, that's close enough to the story. Mm-hmm. You're doing this kind of crisscross to put the pieces together, and then you're saying, because we found, the 4 of the 5 numbers in the telephone number, that means that we know what the telephone number is. We know that they were led by a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. Yeah. And, you don't. I don't know how you demonstrate that. But we had a theist caller that was actually on this topic, and seems to have dropped. And I think that I want to go ahead and address it briefly because it's right in what we're talking about.
Okay, yeah.
And this is why, the question was, is belief in God rational? And why do we think it's rational to not believe in God? And this has to do with establishing the default position on any claim. Mm-hmm. And the default position is rejection of the claim, to reserve acceptance until it's met its burden of proof. And so, for the claim some God exists, the default position is to not believe that until it's met its burden of proof. Because if your default position is to believe it, then you're going to be in a position where you are now believing all claims about gods until they're disproved, which means you're believing things that are contradictory. And this is not the way you want your brain to operate, where it holds a whole bunch of contradictory ideas. So the default position is you don't believe until there's a good reason to believe. Now, what qualifies as a good reason? That's why we've had this discussion for forever, give or take.